Okay, so you have the template installed. Now what we can do is actually directly modify the palettes within our templates. There's already a nice palette template within the node template itself, which we're going to be using to create our About Me palette. And before I get into that, I will explain exactly what that is. So using our newly installed node template, we can actually customize our very own substrate palette or blockchain module. And without further ado, what we're going to do is create a simple About Me sort of palette using substrate. Now what this does is it allows us to assign metadata about a user as a mapping to an address or a blockchain address. So versus having to identify a user by some long unreadable address, we'll use metadata like a username and a description about the user maybe and a set of ID numbers, stuff like that. And that will all be managed by the substrate node template and the blockchain itself. So to start doing that, go ahead and just cd into the node template. And I'm going to be using VS Code for this. You can use whatever code editor you're comfortable with. I'm going to open it just with code, space, and then the dot to open it in the current directory. Okay, once we're in here, I'm actually going to exit out of here real quick, just close these up. Now you should be presented with this file structure. On the left-hand side, you're going to see all the different parts of the node, including the outer node portion, which we haven't really talked about, but it's there. We have the place where we can manage some palettes if we want to, the runtime, which we talked about before, along with some other things to help the node run. Now, what we want to do is we want to go under palettes, templates, and then right here under source, you want to go into lib.rs. This is where we're going to be actually creating our palette, putting all the business logic and things of that nature. There's a few more files here. There's benchmarking, which is a concept which we haven't gone over. This is used just to determine the performance of the functions within our palettes for the blockchain. Mock.rs and tests.rs are both used for unit testing and for mocking the chain for when we're actually wanting to unit test our palette, which we won't do here, but just know that it's there. Go back to lib.rs, and here's where we'll start actually modifying this file to contain our business logic to assign information about a user in association with their blockchain address. So before we start actually editing this file, we're going to go over it briefly, just go over the different parts. If you haven't used Rust before, it's not a big deal. I'll take you through it line by line so you don't exactly have to understand everything, but I will go over some basic concepts of kind of what to understand when editing this specific file. So the first thing we do is that we declare a module palette, and within here, this contains everything we need for our palette, including the configuration for the palette, and this is used to configure it within the runtime. And within the palette configuration right here, this pub trait config, we can define custom variables, bounds, limits, whatever pertains to our specific palette's logic, essentially. So for example, we might want to introduce like a message limit, for example, if this palette was going to send messages. Send a message only can hold up to 248 characters, whatever, something like that. We can also define events. If you ever worked with Solidity before, this is the same concept. Events work kind of the same way, where events are used to kind of inform users on the wider blockchain network that, hey, something has happened emitting from this specific palette. So for example, if a user was created, in our case, we could emit an event that says, hey, the user with this address just created, a new identity or something like that. We also have errors. So we can actually throw errors that show up on the chain to make sure to see exactly what users are either doing wrong or how our code is handling things. In general, just, errors. And we can see that these are declared by specific Rust macros. So it defines what an event should look like, what an error should look like, and things of that nature. There's another macro right above the events called deposit events, and this is what we'll be using to actually interact with the event system. And finally, this is where the actual logic goes. They're called dispatchable functions, and what dispatchable functions allow us to do is modify the state of the blockchain, which we talked about earlier. These are done through transactions, or in Substrate, a word that you'll see a lot is extrinsics, which are basically the same concept. They are things that modify the core blockchain. They are essentially state changes that change the state of the blockchain, very similar to a transaction. We can define exactly what these look like, but just know that dispatchable functions do kind of what they say they do, which is interact with the palette and then also invoke state changes. And this is where we define our functions. So we might have a dispatchable function called register_user, and that will do as you expect. It would register a user on the network and say, hey, we want to create this new state change and we want to store the user on the blockchain. All right, now that we've kind of have a basic idea of what we're working with, we can start modifying the file and adding our custom logic.